The cruelest moment in a marriage is not the signed divorce papers, but one sentence that severs your final thread of sacrifice. When my husband spoke those words, he thought he was asserting dominance. He did not know he had just handed me the key to my cage. He expected tears and begging. You think silence is weakness? Let me show you how to dismantle a man's life, brick by brick, without making a single sound. Hello, wonderful listeners of Zoe Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to keep the lights on. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can provide our hardworking team with the funds they need to cover their living expenses and continue creating these revenge stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment below. My name is Gabriella Daniels. I am 32 years old, and for the last 4 years, I have lived my life as a ghost in my own marriage. It was a Friday evening, shortly before midnight. The sprawling luxury apartment my husband and I shared in downtown Denver was completely silent, save for the rapid, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights flickered, casting long, elegant shadows across the hardwood floor. It was a home that looked absolutely perfect from the outside. Inside, however, the air had grown thick and heavy with unspoken resentment. Julian Vance, my husband, was pacing behind my chair. He was an architect. He was brilliant in his own mind, but impossibly arrogant in reality. He was the kind of man who firmly believed the world should naturally mold itself to his grand visions. He had a massive, career-defining presentation scheduled for Monday morning, and as was our unspoken tradition, I was the one desperately trying to untangle the messy, disconnected threads of his ideas. I sat quietly in the dim light, poring over the complex blueprints and financial projections he had haphazardly thrown together at the very last minute. And then, I found it. It was a fatal flaw in the structural logic of his flagship design. He had completely miscalculated the load-bearing requirements for the cantilevered terrace. If he presented this to the board of directors, they would tear his reputation apart, wanting to protect him. I gently turned my chair around to face him and pointed at the glowing screen. I carefully and calmly explained the mathematical error, using a soft tone to ensure I did not bruise his fragile pride. But logic was an insult to Julian when it did not originate from his own mouth. He hated being corrected, and he hated it even more when the correction came from his wife. He stopped his pacing abruptly. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened with a familiar, defensive irritation. He did not thank me. He did not acknowledge the disaster I had just saved him from. Instead, he leaned back against the heavy mahogany desk, crossed his arms over his chest, and stared down at me with a look of absolute, soul-crushing boredom. He sighed heavily, acting as if my very existence was a tedious burden he was forced to endure. Then, he looked me dead in the eyes and delivered his verdict. Every time I look at you, I wonder why I ever chose you. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to hold its breath. In the past, those exact words would have been a jagged dagger plunging straight into my chest. I would have felt the familiar, hot sting of tears welling up behind my eyes. I would have launched into a desperate, messy argument, pleading for his affection, crying as I listed all the sacrifices I made for him, begging him to finally see my worth. But on this particular Friday night, something inside me simply snapped. It did not happen with a loud, chaotic explosion, but rather with the quiet, clean severing of a worn-out rope. Every loud, anxious sound in my head suddenly went perfectly silent. The desperation, the fear of losing him, the frantic need to be loved by this arrogant stranger, it all completely evaporated. In its place, a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity settled over my mind. I looked up at his smug, handsome face. He was waiting for the emotional breakdown. He was feeding on the anticipation of my pain, ready to feel powerful and validated as I scrambled to appease his temper. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I simply held his gaze, my expression completely flat and unreadable. I gave him a single, slow nod. "You are right," I replied softly. My voice was steady, utterly devoid of any warmth or sorrow. I reached out, gently pushed the screen of his laptop down until it closed with a soft click, stood up from the desk, and walked past him into the bedroom without looking back. When the sun rose the next morning, pouring bright light through the blinds of our Denver apartment, I woke up feeling surprisingly weightless. I walked into the kitchen to find Julian standing by the counter, sipping his black coffee and casually scrolling through the news on his phone. He glanced up and offered a lazy, dismissive greeting, acting exactly as if the venomous exchange from the night before had never happened. He was so incredibly certain of my subjugation. He fully expected me to pour him another cup, sit down beside him, and quietly apologize for upsetting him. He assumed I was just pouting and that, eventually, I would return to the desk and finish fixing his presentation before Monday morning. As I stood there watching him, a bitter, undeniable truth washed over me. Over the course of our 4-year marriage, I had deliberately and systematically shrunk myself. I had turned down 2 major promotions at my own corporate job. I had muted my own intelligence, convinced that a marriage could only survive if one person took the spotlight while the other managed the shadows behind the curtain. I had convinced myself that his success was our success. But looking at him now, I realized he did not see a partner. He saw a stepping stone. He saw a convenient, reliable shadow. As he turned his attention back to his phone, entirely oblivious to the massive, tectonic shift that had just occurred in his own kitchen, I made a silent, unshakable vow. The invisible scaffolding was coming down, the free labor, the emotional support, the late nights spent fixing his careless mistakes, all of it ended today. I would let gravity do the rest. Monday morning arrived, and for the first time in our marriage, I did not ask Julian how his presentation went. I simply packed my leather tote, locked the front door, and drove straight to the sleek glass campus of Origen Dynamics. For years, I had deliberately requested to stay in a mid-level operations role at this tech conglomerate. It was undemanding, predictable work that allowed me to leave the office at precisely 5 o'clock every evening, ensuring I was always available to manage Julian's life. That invisible tether was now severed. I marched into my supervisor's office and requested to be placed on the highly demanding, data-driven analytics team for our upcoming quarterly launch. I poured every ounce of my previously suppressed intellect into my work. The complex algorithms and strategic planning that I used to waste on my husband's architectural flaws were now fully redirected into my own career. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside our apartment was rapidly deteriorating. Without my late-night interventions, Julian's careless mistakes began to bleed into the daylight. By the second week, the complaints from his high-profile clients started rolling in. He would stomp through the front door, his tie undone, loudly cursing his junior associates for their sheer incompetence. He was entirely blind to the fact that his safety net was gone. As my hours at Origen Dynamics extended, I began coming home at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Julian hated this shift in our routine. Instead of questioning his own failures, he projected his mounting frustration onto me. "Are you seriously working late again?" he scoffed one evening, nursing a glass of scotch while glaring at me from the leather sofa. "You are pushing papers at a tech firm. Gabriella, let us not pretend you are curing diseases. Do not let this little corporate phase make you forget your actual responsibilities around here." I merely offered him a polite, hollow smile, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. Let him talk, I thought. My silence was not passive. It was deeply observant. It was during one of his weekend golf trips that my observations yielded a devastating discovery. I was looking for a specific insurance policy in his home office when I noticed a discrepancy in a folder hidden at the back of his filing cabinet. I pulled it out and began tracing the paper trail. Julian had not just been reckless with his designs, he had been reckless with our livelihood. To maintain the illusion of an elite, untouchable architect, the country club memberships, the tailored Italian suits, the lavish dinners. He had secretly leveraged a massive portion of our joint assets. He had taken out a secondary mortgage on our vacation property and maxed out multiple credit lines under the guise of business investments. He was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden debt, frantically trying to keep up appearances for a high society crowd that only cared about his perceived wealth. The old Gabriella would have confronted him immediately. She would have screamed, demanded explanations, and then desperately tried to fix the financial bleeding. But the woman standing in his office simply took high-resolution photos of every single document and carefully placed the folder exactly where she found it. The very next morning, I used my lunch break to meet with the most ruthless financial attorney in Denver. We sat in a heavily soundproofed office, and I laid out the digital copies of Julian's hidden liabilities. My instructions were precise and entirely devoid of emotion. Over the next few weeks, my lawyer and I executed a quiet, surgical separation of our finances. I opened secure, private accounts. I legally isolated my own income and savings, ensuring that when Julian's house of cards inevitably collapsed, he would not be able to drag me down into the rubble with him. I needed one final, crucial piece to complete the puzzle. Months ago, during one of his so-called creative slumps, I had entirely conceptualized a groundbreaking eco-friendly commercial complex for him. It was a brilliant, sustainable design that he was currently pitching to investors as his own magnum opus. I knew that project was his only remaining lifeline. I waited for a Tuesday evening when he was particularly frantic, pacing the living room and angrily barking orders at an intern over the phone. I approached him holding a thick stack of mundane documents, a pen already extended in my right hand. "Julian," I said softly, interrupting his call, "I need your signature on these annual joint tax filings before the deadline tomorrow morning. Just sign at the sticky notes." He rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He snatched the pen from my hand, clamped the phone between his ear and shoulder, and began hastily scribbling his name on the designated lines without reading a single word. He flipped through the pages impatiently, signing away. He had absolutely no idea that seamlessly buried in the middle of those tax forms was a legally binding intellectual property transfer. With 3 careless strokes of his pen, Julian legally surrendered total ownership and all future rights of the eco-friendly architectural project directly to me. He handed the stack back, shooing me away with a flick of his wrist. I took the papers, ensuring the ink was dry, and walked quietly down the hallway. My ascendance at Origen Dynamics happened with a speed that surprised even me. For years, I had deliberately suppressed my own ambitions, but once I unleashed my full cognitive capacity, the results were undeniable. During the final quarter of the fiscal year, I presented a comprehensive restructuring protocol for our global supply chain. I stood in the glass-walled boardroom, commanding the attention of the executive committee for 2 solid hours. I did not stutter. I did not second-guess my data. I delivered a flawless, razor-sharp strategy that projected a 22% reduction in operational costs over the next 18 months. The chief executive officer offered me the position of director of strategy the very next morning. The promotion came with a massive corner office, a base salary of $350,000, and a highly lucrative stock options package. As I sat in the Human Resources Department signing the contract, I felt a profound electric surge of power coursing through my veins. Yet, when I returned to our apartment that evening, I did not say a single word. I simply hung up my coat, asked Julian how his day was, and listened to him complain about his incompetent contractors. My silence was my greatest weapon. As the weeks passed, Julian began to notice a shift. Though he lacked the emotional intelligence to identify what it actually was, I was no longer the exhausted, anxious woman frantically trying to hold his life together. I started investing in myself. I bought tailored, sharp designer suits. I carried myself with a quiet, lethal confidence. I radiated an unbothered elegance that seemed to deeply unsettle him. Julian's own career was actively imploding, and my sudden radiance felt like a personal insult to his ego. He grew increasingly bitter, lashing out in passive-aggressive ways. The breaking point of his fragile pride occurred during a lavish dinner party we attended at an exclusive steakhouse in downtown Denver. We were seated with four other affluent couples from his social circle, wealthy developers, socialites, and senior partners at various architectural firms. Julian had consumed 3 glasses of bourbon before the appetizers even arrived. He was desperately trying to command the table, bragging loudly about his conceptual designs, but the other men were clearly losing interest. Noticing that the conversation had naturally drifted toward a recent economic article I had mentioned, Julian's jaw clenched. He could not stand the spotlight shifting away from him, especially to his wife. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his drink, and let out a condescending chuckle. "Well, let us not pretend Gabriella is an economic visionary," Julian announced loudly, ensuring the entire table fell silent. He offered a patronizing smile to the group. "She works in logistics at a tech company. It is mostly just color-coding spreadsheets and answering emails. Her little corporate job is really just a game to pass the time, while I handle the actual heavy lifting for our future." In the past, I would have shrunk into my seat, humiliated, desperately trying to change the subject to appease him. This time, I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. The air at the table grew thick and painfully awkward. The other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging alarmed glances. They recognized cruelty when they saw it. I picked up my glass of dark red wine, swirling it delicately. I looked at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. I offered him a warm, radiant smile, gently clinked my glass against his, and took a slow sip. I did not defend myself. I did not argue. By simply refusing to participate in his pathetic attempt at dominance, I let his own ugly insecurity hang suspended in the air for everyone to see. No one laughed. The man sitting across from us quickly changed the subject, clearly embarrassed on Julian's behalf. In his desperate attempt to belittle me, Julian had only succeeded in making himself look incredibly small and entirely pathetic to his own friends. 2 weeks later, the inevitable crisis arrived. Julian's firm was threatening to pull his lead status on a massive, multi-million-dollar urban development project. He had completely mismanaged the zoning proposals, and the city council was preparing to reject the entire bid. If he lost this contract, his career would effectively be over. He came bursting through the front door on a Thursday night, his face pale, his tie violently loosened. He was in a state of absolute, frantic panic. "I need you to take tomorrow and Monday off from work," he demanded, tossing his briefcase onto the kitchen island with a heavy thud. He was breathing heavily, running his hands through his hair. "I am drowning here. Gabriella, the city council is tearing the proposal apart. I need you to sit down with the blueprints, analyze the zoning codes, and rewrite the entire structural pitch. You know how to make it sound visionary. I need you to do what you always do." He did not ask, he commanded. He fully expected me to drop my own life, call in sick to my non-existent low-level job, and spend the next 72 hours saving him from his own mediocrity. "Of course, Julian," I replied softly, my voice dripping with manufactured concern. "Leave the files on the desk. I will take care of it." He exhaled a massive sigh of relief, tension visibly leaving his shoulders. He genuinely believed his invisible safety net had caught him once again. On Friday morning, while Julian was out schmoozing potential investors, I sat down at his mahogany desk. I opened his chaotic files and began to work, but I did not use my intellect to save him. Instead, I engaged in an act of highly calculated malicious compliance. I poured my energy into creating a masterclass in mediocrity. I stripped away any bold, innovative solutions I would have normally implemented. I used the most generic, uninspired architectural language possible. I fixed the glaring mathematical errors so he could not accuse me of outright sabotage, but I left the design entirely devoid of a soul. I made it safe. I made it boring. I made it look exactly like the work of a burned-out, unimaginative junior architect. It was a proposal that would technically pass a basic compliance check, but would absolutely never inspire a board of investors to hand over $30 million. It was a perfectly unremarkable document, completely incapable of saving a doomed project. On Monday morning, I neatly printed the revised proposal, placed it inside a sleek leather binder, and handed it to Julian as he was drinking his coffee. "It is finished," I told him quietly. He snatched the binder from my hands with a triumphant grin. He did not open it. He did not read a single page. He did not bother to double-check the calculations or review the narrative structure. His arrogance was so profound, his reliance on my unseen labor so absolute, that he simply shoved the binder into his leather briefcase and kissed my cheek. "You are a lifesaver," he muttered distractedly, already walking toward the door. I stood by the kitchen island, watching the door click shut behind him. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute stillness of the apartment. He was walking directly into a slaughterhouse, firmly believing he was carrying a shield, completely unaware that I had handed him a paper sword. Friday evening arrived, bringing with it a crisp autumn chill to the city skyline. Inside our sprawling apartment, however, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and buzzing with manufactured excitement. Julian, entirely consumed by his own delusions of grandeur, had insisted on hosting a lavish networking event to preemptively celebrate his anticipated victory. He had invited roughly 50 of the city's most influential developers, high-profile investors, and elite socialites. He had hired a private catering company that charged an exorbitant fee of $12,000 for the night, serving an endless array of premium champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. I played my role to absolute perfection. I wore a stunning, floor-length emerald silk gown that commanded attention without screaming for it. I drifted seamlessly through the crowded living room, a polite, radiant smile permanently fixed on my face. I engaged in shallow, meaningless conversations about golf tournaments and European summer vacations. I ensured that every guest had a freshly filled glass and that the silver trays were constantly replenished. To the untrained eye, I was the flawless, adoring wife of a brilliant, successful architect, but beneath the surface, my pulse was beating with a slow, methodical rhythm. I was not a hostess. I was an executioner calmly walking the perimeter of the gallows. Julian was in his element, completely oblivious to the financial and professional guillotine hanging directly over his neck. He stood near the grand piano, holding court with a group of senior partners from a rival firm. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that he had undoubtedly purchased using one of the heavily leveraged credit cards I had meticulously isolated from my own accounts. His laughter boomed across the room, loud and utterly hollow. He was already speaking about the urban development project as if the $30 million contract had been safely deposited into his bank account. He spoke of his unparalleled vision, his innovative approach to spatial design, and his unique ability to redefine the city's architecture. Every word that spilled from his mouth was drenched in an unearned, sickening arrogance. As the antique grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9 o'clock, the party reached its peak. The ambient jazz music playing through the hidden ceiling speakers provided a sophisticated backdrop to the wealthy chatter. I stood by the sleek marble kitchen island, watching Julian excuse himself from his admiring circle and confidently stride toward the center of the room. He grabbed a heavy silver spoon and sharply clinked it against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sliced through the low murmur of the crowd. The conversations quickly died down, and 50 pairs of expectant eyes turned to face him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice projecting easily across the expansive living space. He puffed out his chest, his face flushed with alcohol and sheer vanity. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. As many of you know, my firm is on the precipice of securing the most significant urban development contract this region has seen in a decade. It requires a bold vision, an uncompromising dedication to excellence, and quite frankly, a touch of absolute genius." A few polite chuckles and murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience of distinguished guests. I watched him from the periphery, my face a mask of serene composure. I have poured my blood, sweat, and soul into this endeavor. Julian continued, completely ignorant of the fact that the soul of his proposal was entirely fabricated by my deliberate, calculated mediocrity. We are not just building structures, we are building the future. So please, raise your glasses with me to the future and to the extraordinary success that awaits us all. The guests enthusiastically raised their flutes, a chorus of cheerful voices filling the air. Julian brought his glass to his lips. A triumphant smirk plastered across his handsome face. But before the golden liquid could even touch his tongue, the sharp, distinct vibration of his smartphone buzzed violently against the wood of the display table beside him. Normally, he would ignore a notification during a toast, but Julian was desperate for validation. He assumed it was the official, glowing confirmation from the city council. He lowered his glass, still smiling brightly, and picked up the device. He unlocked the screen, his thumb swiping to open the newly arrived email. I watched his face with the intense, unblinking focus of a hawk watching a field mouse. It took exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds for the triumphant smirk to freeze, falter, and completely collapse. 4 seconds for the vibrant, arrogant flush in his cheeks to drain away, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly pale. The muscles in his jaw slackened abruptly. His eyes widened in absolute unadulterated horror as they frantically darted back and forth across the glowing screen. The email was from the board of directors. I knew precisely what it said, because I knew exactly what I had given them. The message was brutally short and entirely uncompromising. The urban development project was flatly rejected. The board noted that the proposal was shockingly uninspired, severely lacking in any cohesive vision, and entirely too superficial for a project of this magnitude. They stated, in no uncertain terms, that they expected a masterclass in innovation from a senior architect, and instead, they were handed the amateurish, unoriginal scribbles of a novice. The contract was gone. The investors were gone. His career was, effectively, pulverized. The silence in the room shifted from polite attention to deep, uncomfortable confusion. The guests held their raised glasses awkwardly in the air, staring at the host who now looked as though he had just been physically struck by an invisible train. Julian's hand began to tremble so violently that the champagne in his flute spilled over the crystal rim, splashing darkly onto the pristine hardwood floor. He could not speak. He could not even breathe. This was my cue. I stepped away from the marble island and began a slow, deliberate walk across the room. Every eye naturally shifted toward me, anticipating the perfect, supportive wife stepping in to aid her suddenly distressed husband. The rhythmic clicking of my stilettos against the floor sounded like the ticking of a bomb. I reached the wooden display table where he stood paralyzed. I did not ask him what was wrong. I did not offer a comforting hand to his shoulder. Instead, I calmly reached into the hidden pocket of my silk gown and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. I moved with agonizing slowness, ensuring that the wealthy investors standing closest to us could clearly see my actions. With a soft, definitive thud, I placed the envelope directly on top of his precious, empty architectural sketches. Julian finally tore his eyes away from his phone, looking down at the envelope in a state of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Resting cleanly on top of the legally binding divorce papers was a brightly colored, notarized receipt from a premium logistics company, confirming the full packing and shipping of all my personal belongings, which had quietly taken place earlier that afternoon while he was out of the apartment. He stared at the papers, his mind completely unable to process the simultaneous collapse of his professional empire and his personal safety net. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, breathless gasp escaped his lips. I leaned in close, the scent of my expensive perfume wrapping around him one final time. I positioned my lips just inches from his ear, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, soft whisper that only he could hear. "I have thought very carefully about what you said to me," I whispered smoothly, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "You did not know why you ever chose me, and now, Julian, you will never have to wonder about that again." I pulled back, offering him one last, beautifully empty smile. I turned on my heel and walked straight through the crowd of bewildered, silent guests. The heavy oak front door was waiting. I opened it, stepped into the cool hallway, and let it click shut firmly behind me, severing the connection forever. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, a sleek black luxury town car was already idling at the curb. Just as I had arranged, the driver promptly opened the door for me. I slid into the rich leather interior, the quiet hum of the engine wrapping around me like a warm shield. As the car smoothly pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the dark, glittering streets of the city, I checked my watch. It was exactly 10 o'clock. In exactly 2 hours, when midnight struck, every single joint credit card in Julian's wallet would automatically freeze, leaving him standing in a room full of very important people, surrounded by a $12,000 catering bill he had absolutely no way to pay. 6 months passed. The passage of time is a fascinating thing when you are no longer carrying the dead weight of a narcissist. I was now waking up every single morning in a stunning sun-drenched penthouse on the 42nd floor. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the very city skyline my ex-husband had once arrogantly claimed he would conquer. My career at Origen Dynamics had skyrocketed beyond my initial promotion. I was now a key executive, making strategic decisions that moved tens of millions of dollars across global markets. I was thriving. I was also dating Marcus. Marcus was a remarkably grounded, highly successful venture capitalist. He was the exact antithesis of Julian. Whenever we sat down to discuss business or life, Marcus did not just wait for his turn to speak. He actively listened. We would spend hours dissecting market trends over dinner, and he always treated my insights with profound respect. He never once made me feel like my intelligence was a threat to his own masculinity. On the other side of Denver, the grand empire Julian had tried to build on my back had completely crumbled into dust. The frozen credit cards on the night of his disastrous networking party were merely the opening act of his downfall. The massive hidden debts I had meticulously isolated from my own accounts finally caught up with him. Without my corporate income to artificially inflate his lifestyle, his creditors moved in with ruthless efficiency. The bank foreclosed on the vacation property within 90 days. His luxury cars were repossessed in broad daylight. Following the board of directors rejecting his terrible proposal, his architectural firm quietly let him go, citing a complete lack of creative direction and professional reliability. He was forced to move out of our pristine downtown apartment and into a cramped, dismal studio on the extreme outskirts of the city. The brilliant, untouchable visionary had been violently reduced to a desperate man trying to scrape together enough money for basic groceries. But the universe, it seemed, had a perfect, punishing sense of irony, desperate to salvage his shattered reputation and secure a paycheck. Julian aggressively leveraged his last remaining industry contacts to score a senior design interview at a highly respected urban development firm. It was his final, desperate chance at redemption. What he completely failed to research, however, was the recent corporate restructuring sweeping through the sector. Just 2 weeks prior to his interview, Origen Dynamics had executed a massive corporate buyout. We acquired that exact urban development firm to expand our infrastructure portfolio. As the director of strategy, I was heavily involved in the transition protocol. In fact, all final approvals for senior hires at the newly acquired subsidiary had to pass directly across my desk. During his final interview round, the hiring manager handed Julian the standard employment contract to review. Printed boldly at the top of the page was the Origen Dynamics corporate logo. When Julian asked about the new parent company, the hiring manager proudly informed him that the final sign-off for his position would be handled by their brilliant new strategy director, Gabriella Daniels. The realization that I was the actual architect of his previous success and the absolute gatekeeper of his future finally crashed down on him. The sheer weight of his own incompetence shattered whatever fragile pieces were left of his pride. Julian completely lost his mind. My phone began to ring incessantly. It rang on a Tuesday morning. It rang on a Thursday night. He left dozens of frantic, pathetic voicemails. One Friday evening, I was sitting on my plush velvet sofa with Marcus, a bottle of expensive red wine breathing on the glass table between us. I unlocked my phone and pressed play on the latest voicemail, putting the audio on the speaker for the room to hear. "Gabriella, please." Julian's voice crackled through the phone speaker. His words were thick with tears and heavy with sheer desperation. "I cannot do this without you. You were the brain behind all of it. I see that now. I have absolutely nothing left. I am a completely useless man without you guiding me. Please, just give me one more chance. I will do whatever you want. I am begging you." There was a time, not too long ago, when hearing him cry would have broken my heart. There was a time when I would have rushed to his side, sacrificed my own peace, and desperately tried to put his broken pieces back together. But as I sat there, leaning comfortably against Marcus, gently swirling the dark ruby liquid in my crystal glass, I searched my soul for a single shred of sympathy. I looked for anger. I looked for resentment. I found absolutely nothing. There was no joy in his pain, nor was there any sadness. There was only a profound, beautiful, and absolute emptiness. I calmly tapped the screen, deleted the message permanently, took a slow sip of my wine, and smiled as Marcus changed the subject to our upcoming weekend trip to the coast. The National Summit for Architecture and Technology in Chicago is the most prestigious event in the industry. Thousands of professionals gather every single year. I was invited to attend not as a guest, but as the keynote speaker. I stood under the brilliant stage lights of the grand auditorium, delivering a 45-minute address on the integration of sustainable tech and modern infrastructure. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation when I finished. Marcus was sitting in the front row, his eyes shining with profound pride. After the presentation, I navigated the crowded halls toward the secluded VIP lounge to catch my breath before the evening gala. Marcus was grabbing our coats from the executive cloakroom. As I approached the heavily guarded double doors of the lounge, a figure suddenly stepped out from behind a massive marble pillar, directly blocking my path. It was Julian. The man standing before me was a terrifying ghost of the arrogant architect I had once married. His once immaculate hair was greasy and unkempt. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that hung loosely on his dramatically thinned frame. The security guards immediately stepped forward to intercept him, recognizing that he did not possess the platinum lanyard required to be on this floor. He had likely cashed in a pathetic favor from an old contact just to sneak into the building. "Gabriella, please stop," he choked out, raising his trembling hands in a gesture of surrender. I raised a single finger, signaling the security guards to stand down. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I simply stood there, radiating calm authority, and looked at him with the cold, detached eyes of a complete stranger. Seeing my absolute stillness, Julian completely broke, right there, in the middle of the luxurious marble corridor, in front of the stone-faced guards and passing corporate executives. He dropped to his knees. "I was wrong," he sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically against the high ceilings. "I was so completely wrong about everything. You are the only good thing that ever happened to me. You are my queen. Gabriella, I have nothing left. I am working as a low-level commercial broker just trying to pay my rent. Please, I am begging you. Give me one more chance. Let us start over. We can rebuild it all." I stared down at him. There was a time when this display of raw vulnerability would have moved me. Now, it just looked incredibly messy. "Stand up, Julian," I commanded softly. "You are embarrassing yourself." He scrambled to his feet, a desperate flicker of hope igniting in his bloodshot eyes. He mistakenly thought my command was an act of mercy. It was not. I calmly reached into my sleek leather tote bag. My fingers brushed past my wallet and retrieved a neatly folded, thick legal document. I held it out toward him. "Do you remember that Tuesday evening, about a year ago, when you were frantically trying to fix your zoning crisis?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly level. "I asked you to sign our joint tax returns. You were so annoyed by my presence, you grabbed the pen and signed every single sticky note without reading a single word on the page." Julian stared at the document in my hand, utter confusion washing over his tear-stained face. Buried in those tax forms was a legally binding intellectual property transfer, I explained, enunciating every word with surgical precision. You officially signed over total, irrevocable ownership of the eco-friendly commercial complex, the project I designed for you, the only project that could have potentially saved your entire career. His jaw dropped, the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. He reached out with shaking fingers, recognizing his own hasty signature on the bottom line of the contract. Aura-Gen Dynamics acquired the rights to that design, I continued, twisting the metaphorical knife with absolute tranquility. Just yesterday afternoon, I finalized a deal to sell the complete architectural blueprint to a massive European sovereign wealth fund. The sale price was $45 million. That money secured my executive bonus, which I used to purchase my new penthouse. Julian staggered backward, his knees buckling under the crushing weight of the revelation. A strangled, agonizing gasp escaped his throat. He realized, in that singular, devastating moment, that he had not just lost his wife and his career, he had literally signed away his own salvation, handing me the very blueprint to my new empire because he was too arrogant to read the paper I placed in front of him. He was the architect of his own absolute destruction. Marcus appeared at my side, his tall, imposing presence a comforting shield. He placed a warm hand on the small of my back, gently guiding me toward the waiting elevator. The steel doors slid open. We stepped inside. Turning around to face the corridor, Julian was still standing there, paralyzed by shock, tears streaming silently down his face as his world completely collapsed. As the elevator doors began to close, I locked eyes with him one final time. "You once looked at me and wondered why you ever chose me," I said, my voice echoing sharply in the quiet space. "Poor you, Julian. You really should have been asking yourself whether you were qualified to keep me." The heavy metal doors snapped shut, leaving him trapped in the silence of his ruined life and carrying me upward into the light. Thank you so much, our wonderful listeners, for tuning in to the very end of this story. I would love to know where you are listening to this story from today, so please leave your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's story and felt the satisfaction of this journey, please consider supporting our channel. With just a $1 donation, you can help us pay our dedicated team so they have the money to feed their families and continue creating these amazing revenge stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description and the pinned comment. Thank you again, and see you in the next story.